When solving a quadratic inequality, there are several questions one must answer. Let's begin by looking at an example. We'll first start out with a quadratic equation, x squared plus 5x minus 6, and we'll bring in our inequality, less than or equal to 0. Since we have a quadratic, we're going to go ahead and factor this trinomial. So our factored form is x plus 6 times x minus 1 is less than or equal to 0. If I look at these two factors and I multiply them together, in order for this to be less than 0, 1 would have to be positive and 1 would have to be negative. So we'll have x plus 6. We'll start with this one being greater than or equal to 0. And then we'll take x minus 1 and take it less than or equal to 0. In this case, both of these have to happen. So it's going to be an AND statement. But we could also look at x plus 1 or x plus 6 being less than or equal to 0 and x minus 1 being greater than or equal to 0. So the other thing that could happen, or we could have x plus 6 is less than or equal to 0 and x minus 1 is greater than or equal to 0. These are going to be our two inequalities that we have to look at. So we have one positive, one negative, or the other one negative and the other one positive. Solving this, subtract 6 from both sides, so we have x is greater than or equal to negative 6, and x is less than or equal to 1. In this case, we have x is less than or equal to negative 6, and x is greater than or equal to 1. In this case, we cannot be less than or equal to negative 6 and be greater than or equal to 1. So this solution we can go ahead and get rid of. So we're really only interested in this. So from here, we know that x is going to be greater than or equal to negative 6 and x is going to be less than or equal to 1. We can write this as a single negative 6 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 1, or x is between negative 6 and 1. And those are our solutions for x. In example 2, we're going to look at the quadratic equation x squared plus 8x plus 15. Now let's make it greater than 0. So here we're going to start the same way. We're going to factor this trinomial, which factors the x plus 3 times x plus 5, being greater than 0. Now, for something to be greater than 0 means to be positive, so the two factors either have to be positive or the two can be negative. So our two equations, our x plus 3 is greater than 0, and x plus 5 is greater than 0, or we could have x plus 3 is less than 0, and x plus 5 is less than 0. So here, x plus 3 is greater than 0, so x is greater than negative 3, and x is greater than negative 5. Or we could have x is less than negative 3, and x is less than negative 5. So let's take a second to look at those two solutions. If x is greater than negative 3 and x is greater than negative 5, we would simply have x is greater than -3. Since -4 would not work for this part since we have an AND statement. Or we could have this, x is less than -3 and x is less than -5. In this case, only x can be less than -5. Since again, -4 would not work for this part. So here's our solution. X is greater than -3 or x is less than -5. In example 3, let's look at one more that's not set up as nicely to begin with. Let's give x squared is greater than 2x plus 8. Notice we are not greater than or equal to or less than or equal to 0. We want to go ahead and set that equal to 0, so we're going to subtract 2x and subtract 8 from both sides. So our quadratic equation will be x squared minus 2x minus 8 is greater than 0. Again, we have a greater than symbol, so both will be positive or both will be negative when we factor. To factor, we have x minus 4 and we have x plus 2 is greater than 0. Taking x minus 4 being greater than 0, so that means this is positive. Then x plus 2 also has to be greater than 0. Or we could have x minus 4 is less than 0 and x plus 2 is less than 0. Working the left side, we have x is greater than 4 and x is greater than -2. If x is going to be greater than 4 and it's going to be greater than -2, we know that it has to be greater than 4. If x were equal to 0, for example, it would not satisfy this part of our AND statement. Or, from this side, we have x is less than 5 and x is less than -2. In this case, we have less than 5 and less than -2, so x has to be less than -2 in order for it to satisfy both of our parts. For example, if we took 0, again, 0 is not less than -2, so it would not be able to be in our solution set. So here's our answer. X is greater than 4 or x is less than -2. So to reiterate what we've looked at, we saw a less than symbol. Once we factored it, we could have one positive, one negative, or one negative and one positive. In this case, we saw one of them not work for us, so we ended up with one AND statement. When we had a greater than symbol, we had one positive and we had we had both positive, or we could have both of them negative. In this case, one solution came from each part of our compound inequality up here, or statement. Again, in our last example, we had a greater than, so they were both positive or they were both negative. We came up with one solution because these are going to overlap each other. And that is solving quadratic inequalities.